You are listening to Waffle, the bite-sized podcast with Paul Jenkins. First broadcast on Rossendale Radio on the 27th of July 2021. This week, Paul talks to writer, producer and all-round auteur Henry Normal. He talks about his In Conversation series for Flapjack Press with other poets, writing and producing for television, and he reads a piece of his own poetry.
104.7 Rossendale Radio.
Good morning, one and all. If you are just joining us, welcome to the Waffle Hour. It's where we speak to writers, directors, actors and poets of all shapes and sizes, and from all over the world, it turns out. But today we've got somebody who, quite frankly, there's not a way I can describe this gentleman's career without going into too much of a massive CV. He's a poet, he's a writer, he's a TV and film producer, he's the founder of the Manchester Poetry Festival, and he's joining me on Zoom this morning. Good morning, Henry Normal. How are you doing?
Morning, Paul. Thank you for inviting me. I'm doing all right, thanks.
It's and you're joining me for down in Brighton this morning, aren't you?
I am on the southern coast. Yeah, that's how far your reach is these days.
Oh, we're truly international. We had somebody email in from Germany yesterday morning on breakfast. It was, we seem to get out there. The joys of the internet can connect everybody now.
Do you know, I think during the COVID, radio is one of the things that's keeping us sane. Mm. It's because we that personal connection is something that we all need, and there's a lot of people out there that they can't physically get out. So thank you for your missionary work.
Well, I was going to say there's some mornings when I come in at 6:30 in the morning to do the breakfast show that it feels like a mission just to get me into the studio and get me working again. It's an absolute delight to talk to you. Now, obviously, we're going to talk about your career in a great amount of detail, hopefully, or as much as we can pack into half an hour. But one of the reasons that we're talking to one another is, although you're down in Brighton, you've got a massive connection with Manchester, particularly with the Manchester poetry scene, and you're working on this amazing selection of interviews that you're doing in conversation with a selection of poets that are working in the Manchester area, particularly those with Flapjack Press, who we've spoken to before. Do you want to tell us about the In Conversation with series and how it's working?
Of course, yes. No, I lived in Manchester during the 80s and 90s, which was a wild old time. And I loved being in the Manchester Library, the Central Library. I mean, it's one of the most gorgeous buildings in the world.
It is a grand old place.
Yeah, it is. But I actually started as a teenager. I brought up on a council estate, and actually calling yourself a poet is quite a difficult thing when there's skinheads all around during Grebos and everything. And it wasn't until I went to the Central Library in Nottingham to a writers' group that I felt empowered. And so I've always been an evangelist for the libraries, and I did a series for the Nottinghamshire libraries recently of talking to 10 local poets, and the Manchester Library said, would I do a similar thing because of the connection for the Manchester libraries, sort of the greater Manchester libraries this is. And so I'm doing 8 Zooms. And Zoom's quite a weird word, isn't it? I always think of the ice lolly when I think of Zoom.
See, I go for Fat Larry's Band because of the musical connection, but yeah, it's taken on a whole new meaning now, hasn't it? To Zoom something, right. We've verbed it.
As a child, I would have eaten 8 Zooms, but anyway, I'm doing. They're once a week. They're on a Wednesday lunchtime, so sort of Wednesday at noon, and really they're people that are connected with Manchester and the Northwest, and they're all people who've got books out on Flapjack Press, so they've organised it all, and it's great because, I mean, similar to this, we can have a chat, read some poems, and we answer questions from the audience as well, which is great. So if you like the poets involved, I can give you a little list. Jerry Potter I've done already, and Genevieve L. Walsh I did yesterday. So Thick Richard, Anna Percy, Tony Curry, Dominic Berry, Rose Kondo, and Paul Cookson. Now, if you want to interact with them, we have a chat facility, and you can ask questions. And like with ourselves, it's quite nice to sometimes you hear people do a poem. But to actually hear some of the reasoning behind it, and to get to know the poet themselves.
It is, and some of those poets that you've just been speaking of, we've had as guests on the Waffle Hour before. I think Dominic Berry, Rose Kondo, Tony Curry's been on just a few weeks back. Thick Richard came on, and he was very, very good, because Thick Richard's poetry is a little bit acerbic in places and occasionally a bit sweary, but he was very good at keeping himself in radio friendly.
It was pre-Watershed, I think, Richie, was he?
Absolutely. He was a very well-behaved man that day. But it's such a diverse range of poets you've got there as well, all with different stories and very different styles as well, I've noticed, that have come together. So I think it's lovely the way that you're going to kind of get under the skin of the poets a little bit.
I think as well, because it's two poets talking, you can get past the obvious questions, because very often, I mean, you're not doing it. I'm glad to say that you're obviously upper end of the food chain. But sometimes people will say, the most obvious questions, is poetry dead?
Yeah.
As though poetry is one thing.
Yeah.
And you'll see from the 8 poets I've got there that they're 8 very different styles, and so we can get to talk about the individuals and how they express themselves, and I love that, because to me each person's a new world. And so I get to explore 8 new worlds. It is. I mean, just yesterday you were talking to Genevieve Walsh, which is very much, she's got a kind of rock and roll persona about her in terms of her poetry, and music flows throughout her work. And you've got Dominic Berry, where you might be talking about, you may be speaking to Dommy B that day, the kids poet, or you may be speaking to Dominic Berry, the adult poet. Well, you've got... Yeah, funnily enough, with Genevieve, she's only recently had a daughter. So, as you say, it's very rock and roll, but of course, rock and roll mum now.
Yes.
So, that changes you a bit, doesn't it?
She did. I think yesterday I was following her Facebook feed. She said, I think it was just before she was due to come on with you. She said, I think she was referring to her baby brain, saying, just got to remember I don't need perfume for the Zoom call. It's... There's all sorts of things that it's and she's fascinated. She actually opened Waffle as a spoken words version of itself that's based in Ramsbottom. She was actually the first person to she was our opening headliner act when we launched Waffle, the live event. So she's somebody that we know very well here in the Rossendale Valley. All right,
brilliant. Yeah, no, and I say it's really nice to you can get stuck in your, especially with COVID, you get stuck in your own rut, can't you?
Yeah.
So to actually go on an adventure and put yourself into somebody else's world, I think it's glorious. I think all communication is glorious. I mean, sometimes you need a little rest. You've got some music going on. That's always good. You can have while you listen to music. I mean, it's communication, but you sort of it's in a different way. Poetry is very condensed, so we tend to get through about 8 poems. We do an hour.
Yeah,
we get through about 8 poems, but I think that's enough. You can only move people so many times within an hour, otherwise they'll be topping themselves. So,
a little bit. It is generally, it's about the length, isn't it? Spoken word shows are generally about an hour. It's like Edinburgh kind of fits very nicely for spoken word, doesn't it? Because everything's in an hour-long slot.
It does. I mean, it's a strange thing that we're communicating in all sorts of different ways. So, like with music, where there's light things and there's heavy things, and there's humour and there's serious intent. So, there's a big mixture. It's what I like to call a salad or a mixed grill, so there's lots of different things. But I think to concentrate on the words, an hour's probably enough.
Indeed. I wouldn't necessarily go with the mixed grill so much. There's a growing number of vegan poets out there. But we're going to just come to your first music choice, if that's all right, Henry, because we've got so much I need to talk to you about. Now, you've introduced me to... I love it when people introduce me to music and open my eyes a little bit, and my ears particularly. We've gone for I Am Kloot, which, of course, very much a connection to this area. But why Northern Skies?
Well, I love all of I Am Kloot. So I toured with the main guy, whose name's now John Bramwell, but in his early days, back in the 80s and 90s, it was called Johnny Dangerously. And the young poet at the time, Lem Sissay, from Wigan, of course, now an international poet. The three of us did quite extensive tours, and I just think his voice and his lyrics are gorgeous. And I thought, seeing as we were celebrating the North today, that Northern Skies was a good way to start.
It's got amazing lyrics, and it's the perfect way to spend your breakfast time. This is Northern Skies, and this is I Am Kloot.
Like us on Facebook.
Facebook.com/Rossendale Radio.
And follow us on Twitter @Rossendale Radio.
Proud to be your local radio station. 104.7 Rossendale Radio, Lancashire.
Welcome back to the Waffle segment this morning on Valley Breakfast. Paul Jenkins, and I'm speaking to the brilliant Henry Normal. Now, we've spoken poetry very much about your In Conversation series in association with Manchester Libraries and Flapjack Press and the New Poetry Society as well. Quite a group to come together there. But as well, your career doesn't just include your poetry work. It includes writing for TV, for film, producing. Where do we even begin in relation to some of those things? Do you want to tell us about some of the credits on your CV?
Well, it all started in Manchester. So, I moved up to Manchester in the 80s, and it was such a brilliant time because as well as Johnny Dangerously There from I Am Kloot and Lem Sissay that I toured with, there was a very young 19-year-old Steve Coogan knocking around. There was a young...
Steve what? Have we heard of him before? He's done a few bits, hasn't he?
But yeah, the thing is now we know, but at the time, none of us knew whether we got a career, and none of us knew whether or not where the next meal was coming from.
Of course.
So it was exciting because we were on the start of, trying to build something. And there was a great sense of community. That's what I loved about it. So I'd been touring with Pulp because there weren't really any poetry venues. So you had to try and get gigs where you could. So I'd been doing sort of musical venues, and Tameside Theatre in just to the side of Manchester in Ashton held an event where they had a sort of a mixed cabaret, and this was what used to happen in those days. I think Burnley Mechanics and Rochdale and Oldham, they all had all these sort of mixed cabarets, and so you would appear with songwriters, you would appear with comics, you would appear with poets, you would appear with, and I got to meet all the great Manchester people, and there were even a thing called the Manchester Busker where you had 20 events.
Wow!
so what happened then was I was given a television show because I went up to Edinburgh and did an hour show, and of course I got my mates on. So I got Steve on, I got Caroline, I got Linda Smith, I got Frank Skinner, I got everybody, and it was called Packet of Three. And we had, I think it was 45 minutes. Dave Gorman, who's now very big, was a young man at the time. And that was a sort of a starting point. And then as Caroline got her show, the Mrs. Merton show, and Steve got his show with Paul Calf and Pauline Calf, they asked me to come and write for them because I was known as a writer as well as a performer. Because they're so brilliant, Steve Coogan and Caroline Ahern, I thought this is such a lovely, such a fun thing to do. We used to have lots of fun in the writing room. That I went on to write the first series of The Royal Family, and of course I set up a television company with Steve Coogan called Baby Cow, where we made 450 television programs and a dozen films. So including Partridge, setting up Partridge and setting that on its merry way, and of course Alan. I mean, I'm sitting here in a local radio studio talking about Alan Partridge, but I think it's as meta as it gets. But we've of course got that, and the Royal Family just took off. There's some real sort of writing credits, and of course that was, I suppose, a very sort of heady time for you in terms of the amount of attention that was on your work. How do you cope when you've got a hit and you're coming back to produce something new for it? How do you carry on that sort of process of making the character bigger or making them do something new, or how do that? Well, that's you have to, because that's the fun part. You can't keep doing the same joke. So it's always good. I remember when we were doing the Saturday Zoo appearances of Paul Calf. Each week, Steve and I would sit and we'd say, right, Paul Calf, what's happened to him this week?
Yeah.
He's got a dog, right? So we do lots of jokes about him. What's happened this week? He's been looking after his sister's baby. So then we'd write that. So it was really about finding new areas to talk about. And similarly, when you get into it. Now, I was writing for both Caroline and Steve. So I was writing nights, weekends, lunch hours, and so I didn't have time really, to be honest with you, to get worried about it. I was too busy doing it.
It's like a rolling ball, isn't it? I suppose you must. I suppose it's that purple patch, isn't it? Once once the fireworks are going in a writer's brain, it's hard to stop them. And it's interesting. You were saying to me about sort of moving down to Brighton and finding that kind of peace of being down in Brighton at the moment. Is it? Are you finding it a different kind of writing experience now that you're sort of not in the kind of the heads of the zeitgeist of this sort of giant rolling ball of Alan Partridge and Mrs. Merton and all the other.
I moved from doing the writing to and I used to script edit as well and tidy it up and everything. And I have that sort of brain. I've one foot in an administration brain and one foot in a creative, so I'm able to do a bit of both. So when Steve and I set up a company, Steve obviously very creative, went off and did his thing, and I became the head of the company, and it was great amassing again the sense of community which I picked up in Manchester, amassing all these people together. And you'll notice if you look at all our programs, a lot of people appeared and grew through the programs. So the first program we made was with Julia Davis and Rob Brydon, called Human Remains. And actually on the first episode of that is Ruth Jones.
Yes.
Does a guest appearance. And then we make another program, say Saxondale, where Steve's the star and Ruth Jones plays his wife. And then, of course, Gavin and Stacey, Ruth Jones gets... she gets to write it.
Where, of course, Rob Brydon comes back into the fold, and the circle's complete, isn't it?
And so it's again this sense of community, and so really, in a way, I was part of the team, and I was sort of like the responsible dad. I'm slightly older than everybody else. And I loved it. I loved it to bits. But it's not the same as poetry, where poetry is very much a one-to-one. It's something totally created by yourself, and you communicate it directly to somebody else. Because on, say, like a film like Philomena, there's 200 people working on it, so it gets pulled this way and that. Whereas with a poem, it's one person. Yeah, and you're talking directly to one person, so the creativity is raw.
It amazes me how that, like you say, you can go from that, that very personal experience of creating a piece of poetry, but then also, remembering when you're writing for the mass market, when you're writing for television or film, you're talking to potentially the whole world at the same time. It's you must have a very your brain must work on all sorts of different levels.
Yeah, well, I think you're talking to the world in each case. Very often you're talking to yourself first, and the rest of the world's eavesdropping. But if you think about poets, I mean, we're still looking at Shakespeare now, 600 years later. So, I think probably Shakespeare's more famous than anything that I've ever done, and anybody that I've been concerned with has ever done. So poetry is talking to the world. I think the difference, there's a similarity with comedy and poetry in that you're after truth, and you're after a greater truth. I remember an old poetry book I read which said you can describe a shark as a fish, and it's got a fin and it goes very fast, and it's maybe black. That's the description of a shark. But if you say it's a torpedo with teeth, you get more to the truth of the matter. And I think the choice of words and the way we approach things in poetry is trying to find this great truth. And strangely enough, poetry, the reason why we laugh very often at things is because we see the truth in it.
It is that kind of lyricism of poetry and the kind of use of metaphor is a wonderful thing, but I think again that brings us quite nicely to your next music choice, which we're just going to play after the ad break. You've gone for a Bob Marley track. I mean, is there anyone that's better at producing atmosphere through lyrics than Bob Marley?
This is a very simple track, but that's what I love about it. I sing this with my son. I've got an autistic son who's 23 now, and when we're folding the washing, as we do, during the COVID, we sing this song, and it always cheers me up, always gives me joy.
It is. Don't worry about a thing. Can't get an easier message than that. Right, we'll be back with Three Little Birds just after the break.
104.7 Rossendale Radio.
There we go. That was Bob Marley, Three Little Birds. And it's the final part of my interview this morning with Henry Normal, who's joined us all the way from Brighton via Zoom. And talking about, first of all, he's in conversation with series, talking to Manchester poets. We've covered some of your TV and film work. But of course, you are a working poet yourself, Henry. And it's lovely to know that you're still producing things. You're about to go back out on the road again now that we're allowed to. And you've got a piece of poetry for us, just to kind of like ease us into things, haven't you?
Yeah, well, I have, yes. So I shall be at Darwin on the 10th of October at the library, and I shall be reading lots of poems. But most people will know I like to wear a cardigan, which I wear for world peace. Because you can never get angry with a cardigan. Have you noticed that?
Well, I didn't know this about the cardigan. See, I'm a cardigan wearer myself. Not obviously today. It's far too hot for that sort of behaviour. But I agree with you entirely.
Which is basically opening the buttons.
Yeah, exactly. We save the world using knitwear. That's the way it's going to work.
I think that's a good plan. But there are things I wouldn't wear. And this is a poem called "Things I Wouldn't Be Seen Dead In." Mm-hmm. I'll never wear a onesie. I'll never wear Crocs, tank top, flip-flops, sandals with socks. If you see me wearing dungarees, kill me, please. A puffer jacket is in that bracket. But a covering for my face is ace and makes the chances greater that later someone won't be wearing a ventilator.
Ooh. See, there's that turn and twist at the end. Is that something you enjoy? Do you enjoy that kind of like, we're setting ourselves up, we've got a comedy poem, oh, but hold on a minute, we don't want to be... Is that something you try to do?
I like a bit of both. You mentioned, when we were off air, you mentioned Spike Milligan. And it was Spike Milligan that inspired me to write, because he was very, very funny. But some of his poetry, I got a book called Small Dreams of a Scorpion. It made me cry. Yeah. And I love the fact that you can be funny and serious. And if you think of some of the best comedies that you've seen, I'd like to think with the Royal Family, with Gavin and Stacey and some of the things I've been involved with, 1 minute you can be touched and emotional, and the next minute you're laughing. And I think that's how we are as human beings. Yeah,
it is. It's getting that sense of melancholy into the writing, but at the same time through it's the human experience. We're not happy 100% of the time. We're not sad 100% of the time. We go through that whole range of emotions, and poetry's a great way of delivering that, isn't it?
It is. And it's a bit like flavouring. It's a bit like sugar or salt. You wouldn't eat sugar or salt entirely on its own, but it flavours things, so that if you're talking about something, a bit of humour and a bit of poetry helps it along.
Fantastic. Well, we'll certainly be we're keeping an eye on the Darwin Library Theatre. 10th of October, did you say?
10th of October, I'm playing a few places around you. 2nd of November, I'm at Wigan. How far is that from you?
Oh, that's not too far at all. Yeah, we can get to Wigan.
Wigan, of course, is where Lem Sissay's from. And when he played there, he actually texted me and he said, "I've made it, Henry. I've got a full house at Wigan."
Wigan, is that Wigan Pier we're talking, or are we?
No, I think it might have been the Wigan Theatre.
Right.
And I love the fact that this is a man that's been to Ethiopia and performed on every continent of the world, but to actually get a full house at Wigan, spurred him to write to me and say he's made it. I love that. I'm hoping I can text him back from Wigan.
Yeah, you got to get a bigger crowd than he does. Get him on his home turf. That's the answer. It's been an absolute joy to speak to you this morning, Henry. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll obviously big up the events as much as we possibly can. Now, your final music choice, Talking Heads. I think we've got 30 seconds for you to tell us why Talking Heads are amazing.
Well, I love Talking Heads. It stands up. It's this particular track always makes me feel good, and it reminds me of my wife. And there's no better reason for playing a track than that.
There you go. If you're going to dedicate it to anybody, dedicate it to the person who makes things tick. Right. Thank you very much, Henry Normal. We'll speak to you again very soon. Here's Talking Heads.
104.7 Rossendale Radio.
And so we come to the end of another Waffle the Bite-Sized podcast. My thanks this week go to Henry Normal. Thank you so much for coming on the show. An absolute pleasure to talk to you about, first of all, your In Conversation series, where you're talking to all those amazing poets from Flapjack Press, and then, of course, delving into your brilliant TV and film career, both as a writer and a producer. We could have gone on for another 3 or 4 hours, and hopefully we'll be able to catch up with you on tour in October. For those of you that are interested, Henry will be appearing both in Sale and in Bury at the Met, and also he'll be at Darwin Library Theatre, as well as you mentioned in the interview. Lots of and a full national tour as well, not just up here in the Northwest. My thanks, as ever, go to everybody at Rossendale Radio for allowing us to broadcast each week, and of course to Melanie Kemp for all of her work producing and editing Waffle the Bite-Sized podcast. We'll be back with you soon. Stay safe, everybody.